These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Black Study as a Critique of Knowledge and Power with Josh Myers. Africa World Now Project is next. You hearers, seers, imaginers, thinkers, rememberers, you prophets called to communicate living truths of the living way to a people fascinated unto death. You called to link memory with forelistening, to join the uncountable seasons of our flowing to unknown tomorrows even more numerous. Communicators doomed to pass on truths of our origins to a people rushing deathward, grown contemptuous in our ignorance of our source, prejudiced against our own survival. How shall our vocation's utterance be heard? Akwe Irma, 2000 Seasons. Kamau Rashid, writing in Jacob H. Carruthers and the African-Centered Discourse on Knowledge, Worldview, and Power, posits that the sociology of knowledge is the study of the social construction of knowledge. It seeks to explicate the social contextual, political, economic, and cultural moorings inherent in all facets of human knowledge. Therefore, whether we are interrogating the conceptual imperatives of the state or capital, the mandates of school curriculum, or even the policy directives of white supremacy and the worldview orientations that it seeks to impose, we are still speaking of knowledge, its social construction, and the broader social milieu in which it occurs. Accordingly, when considered from the state's perspective, education must inevitably entail notions of legitimate knowledge. However, what is hidden within the language of legitimacy is the political economy of hegemony. The notion of, quote, legitimate knowledge is merely a ruse. It is a means of controlling the conversation about the process of formal socialization, which is schooling. Schooling in the United States is a process that does not typically privilege critical thought and action, but instead encourages conformity to hegemony, rewards apathy to the status quo, and punishes agency with regards to radical social change. When the state concerns itself with, quote, legitimate knowledge, it is not a departure from the historical processes that have established the supremacy of the West or the dominance of capital. This knowledge is of necessity a discourse interested in maintenance of the existing power relations. It seeks, as Edward Wilmot Blyden has asserted, to establish a system of domination. It is the, quote, slavery of the mind. This notion is further elucidated by the critical reflection from Steve Biko when he wrote that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Kamau Rashid writes further in Jacob H. Carruthers and the African-Centered Discourse on Knowledge, Worldview, and Power that, for Carruthers, Africana studies was not simply an area of theoretical inquiry, but was a critical ground upon which intellectual warfare was waged. This intellectual war was not simply over the development of a body of knowledge focused upon African people, but was over the means of intellectual production, that is, the ideational matrix that interprets the world through a particular cultural lens and seeks to reorder the world's political economy along lines most consistent with this interest. The structures of knowledge, that is, dominant notions of knowledge birthed in the catacombs of imperial logic, are the foundational networks that weave together categories of thought that are derived from narrow expressions of power. Narrow in that most of the dominant frames that are forced upon those intent to understand the realities that make up their material conditions are consistently trapped within contradictions. The reification of this limited categorization of power is the web within which subjects of the state seek to find their place. A seeking of acceptance by standards that are defined and determined by those who themselves do not hold true power, but however, through the falsification of consciousness, determines the realities of millions of people who subscribe consciously and unconsciously to the myths of this falsification, which it needs to survive. One place we find this being played out in its most aggressive form is through the disingenuous and empty notions of Black excellence, which is, in essence, an attempt to concretize the idea of the individual, a necessary process needed to combat the deep-rooted collectivism inherent in the Africana ancestral memory and historical being. How did we get here? Why are we here? What is preventing a collective mass rejection that pushes us to flip the matrix of lies that are put on the table? What we will hear next is Josh Myers in conversation with a study collective at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he expands and explores a few of the ideas offered in his recent work of Black study. Also in the discussion are Remy Tawari, research student in the Department of Sociology, the convener of the Black Study Reading Group at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Dr. Mavish Ahmed, assistant professor in human rights and politics, who is the moderator and chair of the discussion. In addition to being a member of the Africa World Now Project Collective, Josh Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He is author of Black Study as well as We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of the Howard University Student Protests of 1989, Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition, and the soon-to-be-released Holy Ghost Key, as well as editor of A Gathering Together literary journal. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, musics, and foodways, as well as critical university studies and disciplinarity. His work has been published in Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, the Journal of African American Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the African Journal of Rhetoric, the Human Rights and Globalization Law Review, Liberator Magazine, Global African Worker, Pamazuka, and Burning House Press, among other literary spaces. It is vital that you listen deeply to this program. Pause. Take a few notes. Think about what you have written. Press play, deep listen, repeat. Take your time, but move with urgency. The current moment requires it. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly.
Honored to be co-hosting this event with Dr. Joshua Myers, the author of Black Study, a really brilliant scholar in so many different ways, which we'll hear all about this evening. So I'm very, very proud to co-host it with Department of Media and Communications and Department of Government. Let me just start off before I go into some introductory remarks and also introducing both Dr. Joshua Myers and the person who made it all happen, Remy, right over here. Let me just start off by thanking the stewards tonight for their work in getting everybody settled, Swanisa, Emmanuel, and Dan. And also, this is from Remy and me, in particular, these thank yous. Nazli Adiguzel, who helped the facilitation of the reading group that led to this event. Black Study Reading Group. And Laura and Maddie from the Sociology Department, who are LSE Comms team, who helped booking, promotion of the event. I was asked to chair tonight, and it's such an honor to take on this role, to host Dr. Joshua Myers this evening, who's going to speak about his brilliant scholarship, which is revealed in his book, which I also had the pleasure of reading over the last couple of weeks, of Black Study. And I'm not going to say a lot, but I do want to say that these last 2 to 3 weeks have been particularly harrowing in the ways that the complete and blatant violence of white supremacy has unmasked itself yet again. And to read your book, Joshua, it was really reading it with a fresh sense of history repeating itself ad infinitum, in a sense that we may not, on one level, have gotten very far, but also I think a reminder in reading an expansive and rich lineage of Black scholarship and Black studies. We were just talking before about how even while Palestinians are dehumanized by the white gaze, most of the world does not dehumanize them, and that we are the majority in that situation. And Black intellectuals, intellectuals from most of the world, which is, I think Partha Chatterjee said, 3/5 of the world's population, actually have a very different way of looking at things. Ethics, values, approaches. So thank you for that. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to read it also at this time. I think it was a really special and healing book to read as well. So we'll be hearing, I hope, about the work and lives of several Black intellectuals: June Jordan, Du Bois, Sylvia Wynter, Jacob Carruthers, Cedric Robinson, and Toni Cade Bambara, who I got a chance to read about. And thank you for charting with such clarity and depth that those who, all of that which is so clearly available to those abjected by power, left exposed to death portals perhaps, but forced to create life, knowledge, and scholarship even in the most genocidal of circumstances. So I'm going to introduce Joshua in a little bit more detail now. So Joshua Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He's author of Black Study and also of Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition, and his third book, We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of the Howard University Student Protests of 1989, as well as the editor of A Gathering Together, a literary journal. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, musics and foodways, as well as critical university studies and disciplinarity. His work has been published in Critical Ethnic Studies, Washington History, and a host of other journals, New Inquiry, Pambazuka, Obsidian, etc. In addition to serving on the board of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations and the editorial board of The Compass, Journal of Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, he's a senior content producer at the Africa World Now project and co-coordinator of the CNCC Legacy Project's Black Power Chronicles Oral History Project, organizer with Washington, D.C.'s Positive Black Folks in Action, and currently working with SNCC Legacy Project's digital movement platform. So a central thread that guides all of this work is an approach to knowledge that takes seriously that peoples of African descent possess a deep sense of reality, a thought tradition that more than merely interprets what is around us, but can transform and renew these spaces we inhabit, a world we would fundamentally like to change. And that's definitely the feeling that you get when you read of Black Study. Remy will be our discussant this evening. Remy is a community organizer and a doctoral researcher in sociology here at LSE. Remy's research project focuses on the coloniality of migration by examining the use of administrative detention against asylum seekers, refugees, and other displaced peoples labeled as migrants in the UK. As an abolitionist, Remy has been involved in migrant justice work over the last decade in so-called Canada and more recently in the UK. For those of you who might be on Twitter today, the hashtag is #BlackStudyLSE. And with that, I'd like to ask Joshua to open the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maj, for that introduction. And also, I want to echo all the thanks for the organizing of this event, and also thank you all for being here on a Friday. I don't know what else is going on, but it is Halloween weekend, But thank you all for being here. This is my first academic talk in London, so I don't know if that will be historic one day, but maybe. I want to start with June Jordan, moving towards home. Where is Abu Fadi, she wailed. Who will bring me my loved one? The New York Times, September 20th, 1982. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all of the arms and legs. Nor do I wish to speak about the night-long screams that reached the observation post where soldiers lounged about. Nor do I wish to speak about the woman who shoved her baby into the stranger's hands before she was led away. Nor do I wish to speak about the father whose sons were shot through the head while they slit his own throat before the eyes of his wife. Nor do I wish to speak about the army that lit continuous flares into the darkness so that others could see the backs of their victims lined against the wall. Nor do I wish to speak about the piled up bodies and the stench that will not float. Nor do I wish to speak about the nurse again and again raped before they murdered her on the hospital floor. Nor do I wish to speak about the rattling bullets that did not halt on that keening trajectory. Nor do I wish to speak about the pounding on the doors and the breaking of windows and the hauling of families into the world of the dead. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all of the arms and legs, because I do not wish to speak about unspeakable events that must follow from those who dare to purify a people, those who dare to exterminate a people, those who dare to describe human beings as beasts with two legs, those who dare to mop up, to tighten the noose, to step up the military pressure, to ring around civilian streets with tanks, those who dare to close the universities, to abolish the press, to kill the elected representatives of the people who refuse to be purified. Those are the ones for whom we must redeem the words of our beginning. Because I need to speak about home. I need to speak about living room where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about living room where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living room where my children will grow without horror. I need to speak about living room where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to talk about living room where I can sit without grief, without wailing aloud for my loved ones, where I must not ask, where is Abu Fadi, because he will be there beside me. I need to talk about living room because I need to talk about home. I was born a black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room. And where are my loved ones? It is time to make our way home. The first line of Black Study reads, "We are surrounded." It was meant to evoke the idea that our enemies surround us. They are everywhere. In the streets, in the wilds, in universities, in the conceptual logics that structures our study. What it calls, what has been called knowledge, determines what is real, what is possible. A definition of the horizon of our destinies that has been created often without our participation. Yet it has real meaning and detriment to our lives, to our living room. It is to the question of these knowledges that of Black Study is principally concerned. It is concerned with asking what kind of knowledge system reifies the destructive categories of race and gender, organizes the world under those signs, and creates categories for human flourishing out of the exclusivities that these signs imply. It seems to me that we might need to know that, but really know it, not merely think we know it, or that we can know it by reference to its creator's ways of knowing it. We need to know these knowledges at their core, from a position outside. For this sort of knowing might reveal how the settler and colonial regimes which surround us require conceptual maintenance in order to produce its sovereign order, which in the Middle East means full-on bombardment In Haiti, it means ongoing occupation. In England, it means surveilling and policing the definition of citizenship. And elsewhere, its meaning is native and indigenous displacement, which continues apace. For the world must be made safe for capital. There is no alternative, even at the expense of human relation to the environment, which is everywhere, but none more violent than in the formerly colonized peripheries. In all those places, everywhere we are, that constellation of belief means and results in violence. These violences maintain their hold on us, on the political realities facing humanity. And so yes, material reality and political choices matter a great deal to how to make sense of and oppose this mess that the West has created. But all of these are knowledges. What is possible politically, and perhaps even beyond the province of the political, is directly implicated in what the West thinks it knows about us, about itself, even, and about the thing called reality that academics believe themselves to be committed to understanding. That is, what is possible is also what is conceptual. And we have been awarded a limited conceptual world that masquerades as the world, licensed by institutions that confer expertise and access to the very power structure that requires those limits be maintained. This is what our degrees mean. Sometimes I wonder if those who claim to be on our side are serious about all of this. Or are we content to teach and write within the same narrative arcs that require our degradation and misnaming? To have our academic conferences and describe reality only to ourselves and feel better about ourselves as we attempt to rescue our fraught disciplinary or academic knowledges with lovely addenda? That is, oh, wouldn't it be nice to include the others? But mere inclusion into the mess does not resolve anything. It does not even address the issue. For neoliberal order has figured something out, often with the complicity of its attendant university knowledges, that there are some who think whiteness can be displaced by simply removing itself as the face of the problem. This seduction enables the West to get away with, or think they have gotten away with, continuing United States empire through black faces in charge of the Department of Defense, or to the UN mission. And here in the UK with a dark face in charge of the changing sane conservative antagonisms, in hopes that some of us will conclude, see, we're not racist after all. Sometimes I wonder if those who claim to be on our side are serious about all of this. As university complexes are more concerned with buying and selling real estate than they are with taking a stand on the side of oppressed peoples, some of whom represent literally the very university communities they claim to be for. As faculty, including some of our own colleagues, miseducate students to consider their professional ambitions as tantamount to actually knowing something about this world or knowing something about the way power decides what is worth knowing. As the academy cheerleads diversity as a solution to the problem of colonial order, as we work in places that can sit idly by and consider that there is a both sides proposition to confronting the specter of actual genocide, what, I ask, the hell are we doing here or anywhere? Sometimes I wonder if those who claim to be on our side are serious about all of this. So I often return to at least one of the questions guiding my work in Black study. And that is, what is this to do with the academic and disciplinary constructs we have been given to study reality? Do we even know where our tools come from? Their philosophies of life and order, their ways, these ways of being human, methodologies to measure the social world, scientific revolution, enlightenment, Renaissance humanism. Are these intellectual products the result of moments in time, not mere moments in the progressive evolution of human consciousness, but specific moments in the perpetuation of the Western knowledge complex which structures the world we have inherited? A world we, those who claim to be on our side, are committed to radically transforming? Do we know what we are doing when we start from within that conceptual world and believe that we can end up beyond it? Do we not need other ways of knowing reality? In W.E.B. Du Bois's The World in Africa, which also, I think, includes a lovely critique of British liberal innocence, if you haven't read it, please read that book. But he says in that book, quote, "Mechanical power, not deep human emotion, nor creative genius, nor ethical concepts of justice has made Europe ruler of the world. Man for man, the modern world marks no advance over the ancient, but man for gun, hand for electricity, muscle for atomic fission, these show what our culture means and how the machine has conquered and holds modern mankind in thrall. What in our civilization is distinctly British or American? Nothing. Science was built on Africa and religion on Asia. Was there no other way for the advance of mankind?" I love that question. Let me just say it one more time. Was there no other way for the advance of mankind? Were there no other cultural patterns, ways of action, goals of progress, which might and may lead man to something finer and higher? Africa saw the stars of God. Asia saw the soul of man. Europe saw and sees only man's body, which it feeds and polishes until it is fat, gross, and cruel. End of the quote. Thinking through these questions is the Black Studies project for me. And though the whole question of what to do with the conception of life and humanity that can only see the body, can only see itself as the province of mechanical power, remains one we must continuously ask. Black Studies can only suggest part of the answer. As Cedric Robinson has written, quote, "It is not the province of one people to be the solution or the problem," end quote. Still, if the notion that Africa saw the stars of God is to be more than just a pithy saying, Black Studies answers must be taken seriously. In Of Black Study, I try to point to the ways certain intellectuals address themselves to the problem, how they developed a Black critique, an African response to humanity's problem space, how they define freedom from and beyond this mess. So, also in the first chapter of Black Study, there's this quote, so I'm going to quote myself. In their conceptions of liberation, the thinkers explored here, however, center ways of being and existing, and of making worlds differently as the meaning and nature of freedom. It is W.E.B. Du Bois's declaration that to the formerly enslaved, freedom was God. The human rhythms of a general strike found in something more than just the American economic order. It is Sylvia Wynter's excavation of Black ritual and jazz life as foundational to oppositions to New World economic arrangements. It is Jacob Carruthers' ability to see in both Black intellectual traditions and Black struggles in revolutionary Haiti the continuity of an ancient African tradition of deep thought concerned with the nature of the moral, spiritual universe. And it is Cedric Robinson's Black radical tradition as a way of accessing the meaning of how to live against Western notions of the political. These were their terms for otherwise. So I think about again what it means for us to be serious in this moment of ongoing chaos and catastrophe occasioned by a fascist and settler colonial recalcitrance that has us living and working in spaces alongside those who aid and abet it. I wonder what it might mean for us to turn away from these spaces and toward each other. I wonder if we will do what is required. I wonder what will happen if we do not. I am becoming fearful in my wondering. I am unsettled by this wonder. I just don't know if we are all certain that we need to unlearn and undiscipline ourselves to even have a chance. I do not know if we even still believe in a we. In these moments, I remember too that our ancestors wondered. And in their wondering, we got closer to another world. When the Maroons wondered, we got closer. When the Black radical intelligentsia wondered, we got closer. When we move ever closer to each other, we enable the imagination. This might be our most radical praxis, our most significant organizing strategy. How might we, as Tony K. Mbara once intoned, get basic with each other? In the years where our awareness that we were in a pandemic was at its peak, we had to figure this shit out because the state did not protect our vulnerability to almost certain death and or disabling. In order to survive, we had to draw upon other kinds of principles. Still, many of us did not make it, for we were surrounded. For many of those who did survive, it was less happenstance than it was learning to live differently. And so liberation will require something similar. For those of us in the academy, we will have to do our work differently. We will have to conceive of our work differently. We will need philosophies, ideologies, epistemologies that eventually displace those responsible for the disregard, for the disavowal, for the deaths. This is a tall order. But we were left with this as the only choice if we are to live. I wrote of Black Study to signal to us that there is another side after this break. There are 6 intellectuals, committed radical thinkers and artists that I focus upon in the text. So I'll just say their names one more time for those who may not have gotten all 6. June Jordan, W.E.B. Du Bois, Sylvia Winter, Jacob Carruthers, Cedric Robinson, and Tony K. Mbara. But please do not let that fool us. That number cannot obscure that there are more. As C.R. James wrote years after he finished the Black Jacobins, referring to Toussaint Louverture, he says, I should have wrote about the other Toussaints, the thousands more. Our genius as intellectuals is derivative. Our genius derives from the people. Our people. And so the 6 that are in of Black Study are not unique unless we center academic thought as Black thought. Because their thought derives from something much broader and much more expansive and much more representative of who we actually are. I chose them because they chose us. They believe in the we. And so they represent models for us who remain surrounded in the academy, who still must counter the lies to try to figure out how we might live. And so Black Studies is a remembering of them. I'm using remembering in the way that Ngugi wa Thiong'o uses it, right? To put back together, to put our members back, remember. To counter the dismemberment of our memories, the amputation of our memories. Black Studies is a remembering, saying who they were, our ancestors, saying who they were so their names would not die. Black Studies is a rhythmic gesture, a beat that keeps going, keeps us up, keeps us there, here, in this radical embrace of struggle. Black Study never lets up, never lets us forget, never lets us stop working, because it is rhythm, and rhythm is pulse. It's our pulse. So I'm going to close with another poem, and this poem is actually an original of mine, and it'll be included in my next book, which is actually my debut poetry collection, Holy Ghost Key. This comes out next February. This is called rhythmoning. For those who are familiar, it's also a title of a Thelonious Monk tune. To lose a name is a certain death. Melodies haunt freedmen's towns in Houston, given an inheritance by working people, all across the landscape of islands, tributaries, and mountaintops, playing in Red Hill Churchyard, clapping to the rhythms of the lives and struggles of Negro toilers, who learned them from ancient blues people whose vibraphone and keybase had other names like Balagon and Kongoma, creative sound as our eternal reflection, so we would not die. Sometimes I can hear those old masters, see their wry smiles, their nods and looks of approval, laughing because somehow their children's children still know a rhythm they played. Not their names, not their language, but this syncopation. Names unknown reappear through death portals in the sound that brings the chill, the whoo, the tears. This rhythm is a libation, a rekindled ancestral fire, making their names show up and break open a drumstick or mallet burdened with carrying thousands of years of memory. They show up to tell us that freedom is in the rhythm. Living is playing rhythmoning. And if you ain't hear that, the fire alarm was for you. Thank you all.
I won't say anything, but definitely undid the university. It was right up there.
So I was asked to answer to Joshua. No, I didn't ask. I actually decided I would answer. So my name is Remy. Actually, just to explain how this event happened is I found Joshua's book. I think in February, and I was reading the introduction, and I was like, oh, I actually need to read with other people because it meant a lot to me to read Joshua's book. And since February, I think we met every month to read one chapter and discuss about each chapter. Some people who were part of that reading group are here tonight, but others were online and in the US. Actually, there are like people from the US also. That's the good thing about like online reading. It's actually that we discovered during pandemic. So that's why at some point I was like, oh, I will invite him to talk here because I felt like he was really like inspiring to read you. And it was really important because also starting my PhD and wondering what I'm doing here and all that is all the questions that you address in your book. So yeah, that's how this event came about. I wrote a text to answer to your book. It's actually more like a summary of the things that I found important for me, for everyone, but yeah, I'll read it. So, in his most recent book of Black Study, Joshua Mayers, it's really weird to actually quote someone that is next to you, but in his most recent book, Joshua Mayers invites us to revisit the initial aspiration of what we now call Black Studies. By taking a serious and critical look at these programs and projects within the neoliberal Western University, Joshua Mayers sheds light on what he calls the lie, meaning the way in which, I'm quoting him, knowledge we call normative, objective, and therefore universal is not simply a fiction or a construct, is a mechanism of power, a force that imposes a particular kind of regime of truth on those who they lie about, who are said to have no knowledge to counter the lie, end quote. For Mayers, the lie, which is in fact the very idea of the West, is then used against those it claimed to discipline within the university. But Mayers is cautious, for he makes it clear that the West's capacity to lie, its claim that there is no truth outside the West, in fact conceal the way in which human life, and Black life in particular, escape the turns of science, knowledge, and reality produced by the West. And I'm quoting him again. To be of Black study is to be against the way in which Western knowledge has influenced how reality, particularly the reality that applied to Black life, has been presented to us. The forms of these presentations take the blueprint from the disciplines of knowledge emerged from the requirements of Western civilization, read here as the intellectual tradition that inspired the modern world. Through a series of 6 chapters, each focusing on a particular Black thinker, of Black study is as much a political project than an epistemic one, in that it calls out and rather reminds us, or remembering us, that to be of Black study is first and foremost to be part of a tradition of thinkers who refuse to adopt a way of being and relating to the world that is a product of a racial and colonial order. I certainly can't do justice to Dr. Mayer's meticulous and complex work by summarizing each chapter. But I do want to include in our conversation this evening 3 elements that stood out for me, not because they are the most important than others, but because they made me think differently in my own work. And in my presence also, as I said, in the university. The first one is hesitancy. Firstly, through the work of Du Bois, Dr. Mayers defends the role of hesitation as a creative force that enables both refusal and imagination. In order to think differently and thus refuse our own negation, we have to accept that we don't know. And that, to quote Du Bois, what we know about ourselves as individuals and communities is a collection of half-truths and myths. In my training as a sociologist, who's still in making, I soon discovered the way in which these half-truths and myths call for a sociology that problematize and rationalize Black life by dehumanizing Black lives, actually, in the name of objectivity, and produce an epistemology that is strictly concerned with suffering, deviance, and death. In Of Black Study, Dr. Mayers points out to how Du Bois rejected this science and its natural laws by focusing on the role of chance in human life. As such, Du Bois defines sociology as, quote, the science that seeks the limits of chance in human conduct, end quote. But what we have at the moment, notes Mayers, is, I quote him again, more laws that rationalize race difference and hard facts masquerading as explanation of dynamic change and human complexity. Instead of studies of relationship between chance and Black life and self-determination, we have deviance, end quote. The second point that I'm still thinking with him here is the notion of reason and modernity and humanity. So my second interest in this book is the critique of what Mayers call the authority of reason, in the production of a set of ideological and scientific discourse on what it means to be human. Mayers is referring here to the colossal work of Sylvia Wynter, in tracing Wynter's critique of what Catherine Youssef calls the humanities. Mayers invite us to not confuse the map, i.e. the devaluation of Black life, with the territory of that is Black studies. As with Du Bois, Mayers show how Wynter's work is much more than a study of the evaluation of Black life, but an in-depth investigation into the assumptions of Western knowledge production, starting with what Carruthers cite as the monopoly of humanity. Dr. Mayers reminds us that the real project of Sylvia Wynter's and others, not to say of Black studies in general, has never been, and I'm quoting him, becoming part of the canon of being human in terms they recognize. Liberation will not come from within the house. The house is implicated, end quote. This is why radical Black thought is a threat to the university, as it is exposing the failures and lies of Western thought, particularly when it comes to define what is human. The last point is the notion of dream and otherwise, or knowledge otherwise. Lastly, Of Black Study is concerned with the dreams of Jordan, Du Bois, Wynter, Carruthers, Robinson, and Bambara, in the ways in which the refusal of these thinkers is above all an invitation to think differently, to expose what Dr. Mayers called the immense archive of possibilities of Black studies. Whether it is the creation of a Black university, the development of a science based on African philosophy and spirituality, or engaging in, quote, the work of unthinking the dominant mode of thought by living against modernity, Dr. Mayers invites us to continue the work of emancipation and liberation by remaining undisciplined. Throughout this book, Dr. Mayers showed that Black study is more than, quoting him, Black content study. It is more than the canon, it is more than science and knowledge, because, as Jordan said, Black study is Black life.
Joshua, I thought maybe if there's any thoughts you have from Remy's response, you wanted to share that. Otherwise, we can open up.
It's a true reading of my intent. I think that's something writers can never take for granted. So it says something to the power of whatever happened in the study group to come out with a. And when I say true reading, I don't mean correspondence with like positive, logical positivism. I mean the intent, the feeling, the essence, the Yoruba would say the ashe of what I latched on to in order to write this book. You felt. So that's what I mean.
Thank you. And thanks, Remy, for your, I think, really deep engagement with this work. I wanted to open up. Please feel free. You can also think about your questions, but please indicate if you have any. We'll go here, there, and then I'll just insert myself as a chair first.
Thank you so much both for that. It was absolutely wonderful and so inspiring, especially as I am doing my PhD in the Department of Anthropology. And I think that at the LSE it's kind of a difficult placement because you feel the history of the weight of this discipline, and at the same time you feel them addressing some of kind of the central tenets of what we've heard today. For example, the idea of what these mechanisms of power are and what reifying certain kinds of categories of being can do to people. I think my frustration sometimes is that I don't think that we do that enough, or at least the way in which we follow certain canons means that we must reify even in order to recreate. I'm wondering, perhaps, in light of that thought, why you chose to use the term Black here. I also use the term Black in my own work, but I do know that in the UK there's a growing movement towards more of an acknowledgement of the African heritage as part of a detangling of the processes of racialization that have worked to kind of differentiate Blackness as kind of something outside and very much other, particularly in light of Sylvia Wynter's work. I also have a question about whether you think there's potential within disciplines such as anthropology to challenge and embrace those kinds of positionalities that Remy, you were bringing out, hesitancy, challenges to notions of reason, modernity and humanity, and perhaps do work with dreaming? Or is perhaps the history of the discipline itself a continuing constraint? Thank you so much, though, very much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Would you say your name was again?
Caroline Basenbanza.
Okay, thank you, Caroline.
Hi, thank you so much.
Please do present yourself.
So my name is Cindy Soamakata. I'm in the geography department. I'm doing my PhD in human geography. And my PhD particularly focuses on Black queer geographies in London and Johannesburg, as I'm South African. And I think when I initially conceptualized my project, I was just like, I'm so tired of seeing scholarship that focuses on Black trauma, that I kind of want to focus exclusively on Black celebration. But then something you kind of realize is that the celebration exists amidst the trauma. In spite of the trauma, it's very difficult to disentangle celebration from hate in a lot of instances. And also another thing that I realized was the importance of the body in terms of producing Black scholarship is, I think there's, and rightfully so, like, you know, throughout history, because of anti-Black racism, the Black people have only been regarded and theorized on the basis of their bodies. So I was wondering what it looks like to produce scholarship in that, you know, kind of recognize the complexity of celebration, you know, of Blackness, of Black life, of reclamation of Black humanity amidst perpetual trauma and devaluation, and reclaiming, you know, the body, you know, and the primacy of the body in understanding and in laying full claim to our humanity as Black people. I don't know if that makes sense. It just kind of, yeah.
It does make, I mean,
Can I try those two?
yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
I love graduate students' questions. And so a lot of the circulation or reception, I guess, of this text has come from grad students grappling with some of the questions that you all raised. And every time it's raised, I probably have a different answer because, you know, there's so many ways to to actually address these concerns and these tensions. And I think where I'm landing tonight is do what you want. Create your own method. Don't follow the rules because the rules haven't gotten us very far. They simply haven't. In fact, they've done worse for us than they've done good. And so to the very specific points that you raised, particularly around celebration, I think about like what happens at Black people's homegoing or funerals a lot with my students because that's the thing that will happen to all of us. We will experience transition. How do African people deal with the question of transition in the moment where our lives have been held on earth? Right? The gospel singer Shirley Caesar says, you know, I'm not going to go through hell on earth and then die and go to hell too. What does that mean? Right? Or you look at our music, our spirituals, right? This notion of flight is always present. You know, flight becomes the way to deal with this notion that this person won't be subject to, right, the turmoil anymore. They've flown away. Toni Morrison writes about this in Song of Solomon, her novel. Flight becomes this theme. And flight is also the way that those who describe the activities of the Maroons described them. And so the Maroons who escaped slavery and created new societies were described as being in flight, right? And so maybe one way to think about celebration amid turmoil is to really think about this notion of flight and how flight and movement and taking or creating separation between oneself and the meaning of that turmoil is the actual mode of address that our people have taken. And I think about that a lot because you mentioned geographies. There's not many places for us to go anymore, right? Materially, physically. But there are places we haven't been yet in terms of our conceptual world. And so what does it mean to take flight from the accepted and from, that's what queer life is, right? To take flight and build something alternative to the thing, even as we are experiencing what may look like to the naked eye turmoil, right? I was talking to a organizer who, in broadest terms, he's a member of the movement for Black Lives and in many different formations, but he's also in the house scene, right, in the United States. And one of the first times he said he brought those two things together was when he realized that, you know, the movement work wasn't giving him the same feeling the same sense of purpose even that the house scene was giving him. This queer space that was created, right, as a maroon alternative in many ways for those who have been quote unquote disregarded or even discarded. And that's really what the scene is, not just voguing, it's actually creating a space for people to live. And so I think about that, and this was a recent conversation, this was actually 2 months ago, as a way to sort of figure out for ourselves that where can we go when we can't go anywhere? To me, that means inhabiting spaces differently now. Especially for our organizers, because our organizers all around the world are tired. Like, it's been a long decade and a half, right? And so we got to figure out where we can go now to remember ourselves, right? Remember our purpose and go back into the world that we still need to change and transform and make inhabitable for humanity. Because if we don't do that, the world will reset, and it is resetting, and it might reset without humanity, right? And so it's urgent. It's, there's a lot of, the word that you use, really interesting word, turmoil, right? But at the same time, there are traditions of people who are repurposing these particular spaces. And I think geography is a great lens to think about it. Like, where can we go when we can't go anywhere? When we are surrounded, where can we go, right? To your question, Caroline, about using the word Black, it's really about affirming the tradition for me. And so Black Studies was the first nomenclature that was used in the late 1960s when these formations were first produced. But when you hear me talk, I often use Africana Studies to name that same project. And I think both are right. They're both righteous, even terms, but they signify different parts of the whole. Black Studies signifies the political and historical legacy of this particular struggle. They were consciously linking themselves to Black student unions, to the Black Power movement, to the Black art movement, right? Which, of course, has connections to the concept of political Blackness. Africana Studies comes out of a very specific maneuver, though. And it may be similar to what you were describing. A decade in, circa 1979, 1980, they decided that the term Black was not expansive enough to explain the human cultures and histories that were under this designation of study. And what that meant was they needed a word that could at the same time have a political resonance and a cultural and historical resonance that linked people in time and space. And Black could do that, but it's a harder task for the term Black to accomplish. And so James Turner and John Henry Clark, two really important figures, both of them are now ancestors, in the evolution of Black studies, they began to use the term Africana Studies, circa 1980. And that's kind of the tradition that I come from as well. Now, Fred Moten, Stefano Harney, several years ago, almost a decade ago, really more than a decade, developed this notion of study as a singular project, so Black study. And they did that in order to distinguish the study that happens within and beyond the walls of the university, which is also my tradition. And so I'm borrowing from their impulse to name something that is not reducible only to departments and disciplines and tenure and promotion and things like that, right? Because what we have to do is remain connected to the places where study happens. And it's not just in our classrooms and not just in our research labs that study happens. Study happens, one of my favorite forms of Black study is jazz. Right? That's where it happens. And, in our churches, everywhere, right? And so that's what this term sort of evokes. And what I've noticed is that, especially in the wake of digital technologies that have kind of taken over, there's much more interest, in fact, beyond the academy than there is in the academy in this kind of work. Much more interest. And I think that's meaningful. And so we have to figure out what the connections to those spaces look like. And so that's where this terminology sort of comes from.
My name is Kamau Rashid. I'm from King's, the War Studies Department. Thank you so much, Joshua. Ruby and I have discussed this book at length. One of the kind of things that I think really stood out for me is this idea of the Black spectacular, the Black fantastic.
Okay.
I suppose. And I really struggle with that because I feel that at times it can verge on the esoteric and the overly aesthetic. And I struggle with this personally in my work, in my research, where I'm engaging with various aspects of Black life, particularly in Tanzania and South Africa. And while I am attempting to move towards reclamations, move towards refusals, I'm also struggling with making Blackness and Black life very ordinary and very regular and very everyday. And I think this is a bit of a balance, a bit of a tightrope that I feel, particularly among sort of disciplines that are attempting to reorganize themselves.
Yeah.
I'm also aware that the institution is also intentionally doing this. And what does it do to further detach Black folk from livingness by making them this sort of, does this make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I hear you.
What does it do is it counterproductive
Mm-hmm.
in terms of really fleshing out Black folk? And I had connected but not also, but I think you sort of touched on it with Carolyn's question, particularly thinking about the various conversations that are going on in Blackness, particularly in the UK context, and also various other European Black experience, African experiences. And there certainly feels a bit like there's a tension now between sort of frameworks that are, we have borrowed from, that are predominantly North American and Caribbean reflections of Black transatlantic experiences. But it's a pushback that I'm not comfortable with personally. But I feel that I'm kind of wondering how you're responding to that. Do you feel that, particularly when you have a title like Of Black Study, what are kind of like your experiences navigating that?
So, very interesting set of questions. And I'm going to come back to your first question about whether or not we can do anything with the disciplines as they try to reform themselves. But it connects to this one. And one of the ways disciplines are trying to reform themselves is by making Blackness into something that they can also add to their project. But it's an adding. It's not a reconceptualizing. It's saying that let's put some Black paint on this, right? So much of that is attractive to a generation, I would say, of academics who come to these particular spaces with no previous commitments. And we know them. I work at a predominantly Black institution. Most of the faculty have no actual commitments. But they also study Blackness, right? You know what I'm saying? So it's, for them, Blackness is spectacular. It's the thing that they are, it's their research interest, not a life interest. Even as Black scholars. And so it's you can imagine what it's like to work alongside these types of individuals, right? When something as, as urgent as, I don't know, pick something, what's happening in Haiti right now, or West Africa. Howard has no comment, or Howard scholars have no comment about it, because it doesn't affect their lives, right? Or they don't see how their lives are affected or connected. And to your point about, this sort of borrowing, if you will, and I wouldn't even use the word borrowing because we are the same people. So this notion, I read a review of that book. I forget brother's name, but This Is Not America or something like that. And this notion that, this notion that blackness here is different because of, as if empire didn't happen, right? Or as if black life here is not in many ways connected to the ravages of empire, right? There's this sort of this liberal erasure that I see happening because America gets to be the big and bad racist country. That's not us. Even as it, has resonances across these differences. In fact, I teach a whole 2 weeks on my Black Thought in the Diaspora course on Black Britain, and our students, once they get the text, once they get in terms of these connections and the political kind of relationships that have been shared for generations, the diaspora wars stop immediately. Because the diaspora is a fiction, right? It's a social media fiction. Let's look at the concrete reality. And once they are able to do that sort of displaces it. But now that fiction gets wide purchase in a publishing industry that needs for there to be a conversation around blackness that's not serious at all. And that's why a book like that can be published and could be reviewed in some of the largest publications in the world. It's like, oh my God, they're talking about race in Great Britain, but they're not talking about it like America. This is interesting. This is new. No, it's not. And so that's sort of what I think about when you raise that. But also, are you familiar with Richard Iton's work on the Black Fantastic? This is, yes, in search of the Black Fantastic.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Please read and reread it. Read that book, because what he argues is that the fantastic is not this notion of something that is so unique and unreachable and so fanciful that it's, unattainable for us to even. No, the fantastic is the actual ordinary. Black people's ordinary is in fact evidence of a fantastic, meaning it's fantastic because it exists outside of the quote-unquote accepted definition of political theory and political reality. And so just really quickly, the thesis of that book is that when you exclude people from political access or political sovereignty, whatever it is, their quote-unquote response or their quote-unquote reaction or their quote-unquote political opposition takes places in ordinary spaces. Tell me I can't vote. All right, so I'm gonna put my politics in the blues. And then you have to reckon with it differently, because this is going to circulate much better than somebody's political argument or essay. That's the fantastic. And in fact, he says these are minor key sensibilities in Black folks. And so it's I'm wondering how that book, because that book takes us from Cold War United States to Garvey and Garveyism all around the world. It takes us to anti-apartheid, South Africa. It takes us everywhere, because everywhere you see exclusion, you see Black fantastic. And the Black fantastic emerges in the cultural and art space. Then the contradiction comes. What happens when you try to buy and sell the blues or buy and sell reggae, right? In fact, there's a whole chapter that talks about lovers rock and how lovers rock emerged at a particular moment, and then reggae comes later on, and how these things circulate and what it means for us to talk about these notions of love and romance and then revolution as if these two things are completely different categories, when they in fact they were not to the people creating these particular expressions. That's the Black fantastic, right? And so to me, getting to a point where we can understand all of this, we can't abandon the word Black to people who don't want it to be all of that too, right? I think we have to keep it. I think we have to keep it and root it in something that is not these sort of fictions that are appended to it by a knowledge complex that is seeing it as a commodity that they can buy and sell. And that's difficult to do. And I think, again, music provides us a great lens for that, right? So the moment somebody decided to put the blues on the record, like, that's a certain death. So you have to remake it into something else. The moment somebody decides to put lovers rock, you have to make it into something. this constant recreation, right? But not losing the core, because the blues is still in R&B, right? Or it's still in neo soul, or it's still in whatever we create next, right? But it's moving out to speak to a different reality, because the appropriation is something that we have to resist constantly. That's why all of the musics are radical, right? Or considered to be radical when they start. Like, oh, this is a radical thing. We don't understand it. In fact, we hate it. It's like, yes, that's the thing that we should be doing. What they hate first. Because that's where the resistance happens. And I think the same is true of all of our expressions of the fantastic, right? Even beyond music, right? We have to resist the appropriation by understanding that it's resisting a kind of definitional singularity. Is it, I guess, like you can't define it in the way that contains it. It's like when I ask my students, what do you mean by soul? Nobody can answer that for real. But you can say when somebody don't have soul. Well, this has no soul. But what do you mean? It just doesn't have it. This is a thing that can't be defined or contained. That's in everything. And when you try to appropriate it, doesn't feel the same. Like when you try to buy and sell soul, it's like, no, we don't want that. It's not the thing. It's not something to be bought and sold. It's something to be felt in an organic way. And so that to me is the Black Fantastic. And Richard Aiton, who that book came out in 2009, and I've taught it maybe 5 or 6 times. I see the opening that it produces in my students because they all have those minor key sensibilities. They just haven't been able to name it as resistance, right? And that's really important because so much of, especially in Richard Aiton was like a heretic in political theory, right? So he's talking about popular culture and political theory. Like, it's not serious. But so much of what they recognize in that particular text exists in categories that they were told that are not legitimate political categories. And that allows the opening to happen. So, thanks for that question.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk and the work. So my name is Tanisha and I'm based at King's. And a lot of my work at the moment looks at the theory of Afro-pessimism.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly thinking about that in terms of Frank Wilderson and how he has articulated Afro-pessimism. And thinking about how he positions Black people in relation to human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of controversies that come up around that positioning. And my work looks at health inequality, so I often talk to my students about this theory and kind of ask them questions about how we can think about Afro-pessimism in anti-racist work.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're recognizing these racial disparities in health outcomes, and we think about this positioning of Black people in relation to human beings, like how helpful is this framework in kind of teasing out and reducing and resolving some of these health outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on Afro-pessimism and
Mm-hmm.
this idea of Black people as being non-beings, so thinking
Yes.
of us as non-humans.
Right. So I actually, in chapter 2, which is on Sylvia Winter, there's a really, I think, probably 2 historical evolution of that. She roots it in, I shouldn't say 2. I say that because you would not expect the conversation to start in 15th century Spain, right? Most people kind of root that conversation in not only the English-speaking world, but in a very recent sort of evolution, probably the 19th century for most people in race science, right? If they go back that far. But Winter is like, no, it's in Spain. Why is it in Spain? Spain is confronting this as they are, quote unquote, colonizing the New World, right? And so she's thinking about Spanish conversation, Portuguese conversation that, Britain and France only inherit. and add to, certainly. Germany too, right? And so in that chapter, we go back to that particular moment, 14th and 15th centuries. And in particular, the transition from a religious designation to a political one. And the designation is all about, in a broad sense, who belongs, right? It moves from who is Christian, who is infidel, to who is citizen and who is slave, right? And it's not automatic, right? It takes a while, right? And it takes a lot of intellectuals to make it happen, right? Many of these are colonial intellectuals who are actually building universities to, in fact, help structure this, right? And so, interestingly enough, this happens before there's even a concept of science writ large. I mean, there's what Aristotle was called science, but there's not quote unquote scientific revolution yet. So it's happening in the humanities first. It's the humanist conversation, which to me gets at what Wilderson and others are trying to get at, is that there's something funky at the root of the very definition of political order and political society that has exclusion baked in. It's baked in. But Winter takes us to the root, or at least one root. I mean, we can probably find multiple roots if you think about this long enough, right? And this thing was put in place by the time Africans are introduced, 1502. She writes about this with respect to the Portuguese, right? They moved from being called pretos to negros, right? And the negros is a very specific political designation that meant non-human and slave, whereas pretos simply described how they looked. And so when this change happens among the Portuguese and the West Central Africans, the Bakongo peoples, that's when the notion of what Wilderson and others were talking about, that's when it takes root, right? But it took root because there was something before, and something before, and something before, and something before. And so for me, I think that project is really important in helping people understand the modern world, like where we actually are, right? There's a reason that, Haitian lives are not considered precious, that we can actually turn away in the face and in specter of their decimation, or even the Gazans. We can turn away, right? And so Afro-pessimism helps us understand that, even as there are some who will argue that Afro-pessimism doesn't help explain Islamophobia or so, but I think it does. It should, in fact, right? I mean, there are African Muslims. In fact, when you think about, some of the religious identities of the initial enslavers, some of them saw the Africans as infidels first, right? And so Islamophobia is actually implicated in this whole thing. And so all of that to say, Afro-pessimism can help us understand the antagonism. I think when it moves away from that, or when we move beyond that, it doesn't help us understand what happens after the break. In other words, I think it forces us to accept that the antagonism is all there is. I said we are surrounded, but we as I said in my earlier answer, right? We can go places when we can't go anywhere, and that's where at least some Afro-pessimists argue, we can't even focus on that otherwise or that other side because we're surrounded, right? And so I think about, for instance, the interventions of Christina Sharp. I've never heard her call herself an Afro-pessimist, but she's definitely almost always categorized as one. And in her 2016 book, In the Wake, she talks about us being surrounded by death. Like death is our, and then she says there's something called wake work. And wake work is how you move out of it and how Black people move out of it. In fact, she talks about wake as a celebration too, right? And I think that's where some of the kind of Afro-pessimist thinking hasn't followed her in that way. And so I would, if I were in conversation with them, I would wonder what their feelings about whether or not we are only and always and forever going to be the antagonism to whiteness, how they feel about that. Because I come from a people where whiteness is out there, but we are also who we are, right? I grew up in a part of South Carolina that was almost 90%, probably 90% more Black. And yes, we would get stopped by the police. And that's when we saw white people. And then we would go home and there would be no specter of whiteness at all. How do you describe that living? Because that's the living that fundamentally shapes who I believe myself to be. It's not whether or not there's a policeman outside, even though we know that they are. They know that any moment they can come in here, take us to jail, ruin our lives, whatever, right? But we don't define life as that relation. And so that's what I would say to that. And it's something that I'm constantly thinking about because there's, at least in the United States, one segment of the Black graduate student community, I'll be very specific, that actually believes that Black studies is Afro-pessimism. Like there's actually a segment that believes that. And I'm constantly thinking about it for that reason. How did that happen? Like, how did Black studies become conflated with a theory of Afro-pessimism? To me, it means there's something happening in our graduate programs, that's the most attractive lens. It says something about the university, the concept of the university. It says something about how students are being introduced to themselves through the university. It says a great deal. But I'm interested in it. I wouldn't call myself an Afro-pessimism, but I do think it resonates in terms of us understanding the modern world.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. My name is Nadine. I'm a PhD student at Birkbeck. I'm also Jamaican, living 30 years in unceded territory of the west coast of Canada. And my project deals with Blackness and indigeneity. I'll be very specific to unceded non-treaty territory, which makes for a different sort of relationship. I wanted to thank you for opening with June Jordan, because I'm watching, as I've been Gaza, as we all are, I've been watching this for years, and watching the deporting of Haitians in Jamaica right now. So folks sailing to my island and being deported. There's a great Jamaican lawyer, Aline, that's in the battle for their right to stay and find sanctuary in Jamaica. My question is tied a little bit to this. Thank you for your thoughtful address on Afro-pessimism. I mean, it's very interesting. You kind of glided towards it, but for example, Sylvia Wynter's No Human Involved, which is one that's often cited. But I'm that cat, being from the West Coast and being from an unceded territory and being from a place where murdered and missing Indigenous women and residential schools is a very real thing. And so when I researched that NHI term more closely, Sylvia Wynter's not the only one that wrote on it. There's Latina folks and other folks, and I would say Indigenous folks, if you know anything about LA and urban various areas, the making of the Daystar Native Community Center in Seattle. Like, there's, being a West Coast person, I could pay attention to other things that Sylvia at Stanford may not have been able to pay attention to, because she was battling the university in many ways in terms of her writing, and is kind of isolated, to a certain degree with kind of the program, and I think not being understood coming out of the Caribbean and her particular Spanish background. I was in Huelva, Spain, which is a major Spanish port this summer. You know, like reading her and being able to respond to Spanish students, thinking on Blackness is really, like, she's amazing in that regard. She's given me purchase there. Well, my question then is always about genealogies. So I'm that strange cat that reads people's BAs, MAs, and PhDs, and then looks at how then their book project shows up.
Yeah.
Or I look at, you know, politicians in the Caribbean. I look at their PhD and I'm like, God, you were such a radical. Like, what happened? You're the Minister of Finance. So I'm very interested in your PhD at Temple and its construction, because what I see here is that, you know, you had Cooper and you had Bond. You had a few women that I'm being very vague here, and I don't want to disrespect the breadth of your projects and what you did. I'm quite interested in how that, how it's constituted, because Winter's not in there, and Jordan is not in there, nor is Bambara.
Right.
So I'm interested in what was the journey for you from the PhD to this particular text. What inspired you to include them? I mean, Tony Bogues is editing it, so he would have fought me probably the whole way, like, Sylvia Winter cannot, like, not be in this text, right? I've had these conversations with him. So if you can respond to this.
That's a really good question. I think no one's ever asked me that specific question. In particular, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about my dissertation and, you know, what I was thinking about in that particular project. So in the dissertation, Cooper, Anna Julia Cooper, is there largely because of her writing around the question of the Haitians. When she got her PhD at the age of 61 or something, she was 61 years old, something like that. After she had already had a life, she goes to Sorbonne to get her PhD, has to learn French, and then get the PhD. She writes on the Haitian Revolution, and that comes out in 1925. But this was years after she wrote her most famous book, A Voice from the South, by a Black woman from the South. I know the subtitle. By a Black woman from the South, where she argues in part that there is such a thing as women's ways of knowing, right, in that particular text. And so she is there because her contemporaries are there in my dissertation, Edward Wilmot Blyden and W.E.B. Du Bois. And so when I was at Temple, there was only one course on Black women's intellectual history. It was taught by Dana King, who is an adjunct professor teaching a graduate school seminar. And so it wasn't like this notion that we should study Black women's thought was not baked into the cake at Temple. And so here's what actually happens, right? I'm defending my dissertation. Made it already to the defense. And we have an open Q&A at my defense. And a scholar, a French scholar, Dr. Roger, last question, it was like a marathon. He gets up and says, "Where is Sylvia Winter?" That's what he said. And at that point, my training didn't require that I read Sylvia Winter. And I don't know if it was the African-Centered, Afrocentric training part of it, or if it was just, we don't start here or we don't go here. But whatever it was. And so what I did after I finished my dissertation that summer, I read every piece of Sylvia Winter's work that I could find. And that's what you see reflected in this. And so it actually wasn't Tony. In fact, Tony, I had pretty much, planned to write a chapter on Sylvia before even meeting Tony and before Tony even seeing my proposal for this particular book. But I will say this. I think I can say this. I hope I can say this. Tony is extremely close to Sylvia Winter. And there's a lot of trepidation when you submit a manuscript.
Absolutely. And he's working on Black Metamorphosis with Abador, so that's a big one.
Right.
Everybody's waiting for us.
Right. And he's writing a biography
of
Sylvia Winter. So, when I submitted, there was a lot, oh my God, Tony's going to read this. And it's also guiding how I'm writing. Tony's going to read this. And so that was, it felt good when, Tony read it and there was not a whole, 10 paragraph email of notes saying that. So, yeah. No, Tony and June. So basically this happened. Connor Thomas Reed, who's at City University of New York, Graduate Center, and his comrades basically went into the archives, City College's archives, and found all this writing that Tony and June and others, including Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, because they were all colleagues. I can't even fathom that. Barbara Christian too, like they were all colleagues. And they published a series called Lost and Found. And one of the articles in that series was an article called Realizing the Dream of the Black University. And when I saw that, I knew that I had to write about Toni Cade Bambara. I knew that I had to. She too wasn't part of my graduate school education and training. I came to Toni. I knew Toni in undergrad. I knew her work in undergrad, but it was mostly the stories. So Gorilla My Love, but it wasn't the essay. And her essays are something. Her essays are something. Yeah. And so once I started realizing the dream of the Black University, it resonated like the way that Remy resonated with me just now. It's like, okay, this is it. And that's why the conclusion is dreams. And in that particular same series, there's a collection called Life Studies by June Jordan. And in that collection, she's directly speaking to her relationship to not just Black studies, but also education in general. So she has this really brilliant commencement speech for 8th graders. Graduation speech where she's telling these 8th graders, make study serious part of your life. Like damn, June, to 8th grade. Yes, to 8th graders, because that's how serious this is. But June has always occupied a place in my introduction to Africana Studies courses, because her essay, Black Studies Bringing Back the Person, is almost like one of my manifestos. And that's where my book starts. It starts with We Are Surrounded. Those are my first words, but the first words are actually June's, when she talks about, what the stakes are for Black studies. So those are two people who aren't necessarily centered genealogically in my training, but I came to when it became time to really center and think about how specifically Black women are engaged in this conversation. And there's more that I want to do, because I'm only scratching June's surface and Tony's surface in this book. Like, Winter does a deep dive, right? But in terms of June and Toni, I'm only scratching the surface. And, I wanted to get into Tony's papers. Pandemic prevented it. June's papers are Harvard. Pandemic prevented it. So there's still more to be done in specific their relationships to Black studies. And it's not just them. Someone needs to do something on Sonia Sanchez's relationship to Black studies. She's the first teacher of Black studies, one of the first teachers of Black studies, as a poet, right? Someone needs to do the same work with people like Barbara Christian and that generation, because I will say that there's a way that they're being overshadowed, not just by men, but by ignorance, right? People don't know that these people were in Black studies. It's a revelation. Sonia Sanchez taught Black studies, right, for years. And so, yeah, I think that ignorance is because of the credentialing and where they taught, right? And it's also the case that, artists were more prominent as professors during that era, right? Sun Ra taught Black studies courses. James Baldwin taught Black studies courses. I can go down the list, like musician Archie Shepp, Max Roach taught Black studies courses. These are the people who the students wanted to be their professors. And so there's a conversation to be had just on that. Like, what's the relationship between Black artists and Black studies? So is this in service to understanding how race operates? Or is it a question of cultural identity for you?
Well, I think to go beyond cultural identity and the politics of identity.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to go more towards politics and epistemology. But like I said, if we are a bit murky about the idea of blackness, how do we then, for example, identify resistance or those patterns that we see in the Black Atlantic, like refusal and the names that were named, Christina Schwab and all those big names, really.
Yeah.
How do we go beyond that?
I have to think about this one. Because it's so ever present everywhere that we often don't stop to think about the ways that it might not be as present or as identifiably present, if you will, or named in the same way, if you will. And so how do you name something that hasn't been named before? So I have a student from Ghana, PhD student from Ghana, who reads all the things that we say read and then says, yeah, this is not going to work in Ghana because that's not, the language doesn't help us. And so maybe the route towards you resolving this is somewhere in the languages that you're working with. How do they identify the question of difference? Maybe it's not blackness, but difference or hierarchy or some way of looking at the political implications of what you're studying without routing it through English might be the solution.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about it and how to go beyond language and look, like somebody earlier said, into embodied practices.
Yeah.
Dancing, we dance a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really speak it. We do speak English, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
We speak English. But we speak Creole, French.
Right.
There are many ways of expressing.
So one of the things that Winter talks about in the book, Black Metamorphosis, which again, it will be coming out soon. I actually got a chance to read it for this book. But one of the things that she talks about is the ways that enslaved people reckoned with their new situation wasn't through the political categories that were resonant in that particular space, but through something that they brought with them that had to be reapplied to this particular condition. And I think about this a lot, right? Because when people resisted enslavement, they weren't coming out of schools of thought that are recognizable as resistance today. They were coming from somewhere, but they weren't coming from the sort of, they weren't creating vanguards and having political education. They weren't doing all of that. And so it means that there was something in their language, in their culture, that made sense to what they were experiencing that was new. Because otherwise they would not have resisted. They would not have done. And so there had to be terms, in other words, that they came with that helped them explain this new antagonism. And that's what my student, is helping me see. But it's also present in the work of Winter. It's present in the work of so many of our predecessors. Robinson is trying to grapple with this, right, in Black Marxism. And so Winter lands on, again, this idea of she calls it a model of regeneration, right? African cultures are thinking about this question of regeneration. Meaning, how does a thing that we thought was dead or is dying, how does it live again? And so this notion that life is a cycle, right? Moving against linear and progressive notions of movement in history, right? She finds that most West African cultures practiced some model of regeneration when it came to the question of how to sustain human life. Meaning, how you feed yourself, how you clothe, how you build things, like all the things, right? And none of this makes sense if you don't have any spiritual or ritual resonance or practice. And so to me, race might be present in what you're studying. But if it is, it's probably not indigenous to how people make sense of the world. And so it's probably the question that you start with. I think a Black Studies approach would be to start with how they make sense of the world and then understand how they incorporate racialization into that particular matrix. And that's why I think it might start with language, because that's like the building block of understanding any human group. So, yeah, in again, not having the answer for you, but in thinking about it right now, that might be a way forward for you.
Thank you so much. My name is Emmanuel. I'm a fourth year PhD student here in the geography department. And hearing you speak and also listening to Remy, I push myself to consider a bit of the work of Fanon and Achille Mbembe, when Fanon is talking about, considering the black man as, and also the black woman as being in this neurotic situation where there is a constant fight for recognition by the white person, or actually like a decreasing of blackness in their personality. And Achille Mbembe is, doing some work where what he's trying to do is to actually say, I'm working with Fanon and against him, and moving toward this situation where they seems to both converge and make a case for the black or the African man to be forward-looking in his development and not necessarily being focusing necessarily or entirely on the trauma, on the pain, acknowledging that it has happened, but still being forward-looking and working for some sort of common humanity. And thinking about that, I'm tempted to ask you, would you consider your work on Black study to be, or where does your work would stand, in regard to, both these argumentations about defining, blackness or, Africanity, if I can use that word.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly on the African side, I think. I hope it's on the African side. And the reason for that is, I think part of recognizing that we're very old people, right? Is that, our life doesn't start when somebody designated us as the blacks. It doesn't start there. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's my colleague, she's probably been to London at some point, talk about the 1619 project, right? This notion that Black life starts in 1619 in many ways is what that stipulates, or Black American life, as if there is a starting point. The children's book version of the 1619 project is literally called Born on the Water, meaning Black life starts in the middle passage. I was like, no, it doesn't. It does not. Which means that if it doesn't start there, how do we orient ourselves when we are describing ourselves? And so for me, it's really this is also Sylvia Wynter, like we have to really engage with Africa on Africa's own terms, but certainly we have to engage with Africa in order to get out at least part of this mess. And so I resonate strongly with Fanon when he talks about this notion of sociogeny and turning over a new man and all the things. And then I think we should extend beyond that to say that when you do say new man, or thinking about sociogeny in all the different ways, where does the old man show up? Right? Like, how do we do this before, right? And it's not a choice between forward looking and backward looking, because life is a cycle. It's simultaneously forward and backward, right? All of our traditions say that. Sankofa says that, so on and so forth. And I think taking that seriously means, moving outside of certain binary epistemologies that we constructed, and also, being confident that when we move out of those, that we still can offer resistance to that regime. Like it's not an abandoning of struggle when you say, I'm not talking about this in the same way anymore, but I'm talking about it this way. So yeah, I to reaffirm, I hope it's on my work is on the African side of things at the end of the day. And it's not, saying that racialization is our forever and ever reality and our forever and ever identity.
In the discussion that we've had so far, but also very much emerging from some of the people I met whilst doing my fieldwork who wouldn't ordinarily be kind of friends, I guess, within the London Black community, who, as this conversation have developed, I've started to think, how might we consider their positionalities as maybe kind of resignation as refusal? Kind of like very strong positions that do a thing of saying, well, it's not because we're Black that this situation is as it is. It's because perhaps we're not working hard enough, or perhaps we're not allowing ourselves to understand the liberties that this life can provide for us. I think that was very much something that I was doing kind of ethnographic fieldwork. I was very startled by that position, and also quite unsure about how I'd have to now contend with that in my own work. But it did appear.
So I chuckle because like when the police killings in the United States really began to take on a kind of public outcry, I remember elders, particularly elders in my community, elders without, credential, right? Elders without access to these libraries that we have, who would say things like, well, I know the police are killing us, but we are our own worst enemies. And I had to take a step back. Like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? We are our own worst enemies. And what it meant, it could have meant two things, but what I think it meant was that the expansiveness of the propaganda and the lies we have not seen before. I don't think we've seen it before. Meaning everything that's not what we're doing here is telling us lies. Constantly. And so the people that don't have access to these alternatives, if they do have access to anything, it's to a lie. And at least in the States, there's less and less stuff to counter it over the last 20, 25 years, because there is almost no strong associational life anymore. People don't go to spaces where it's just them, right? That's what I mean by that. Clubs, organizations, churches, blah, 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 whatever it is, which historically in the Black community was where the lie was countered. And so if you don't associate with anybody and all you see is what the propaganda produces, you can easily accept this, right? And it's only when you sit down in spaces, what Fred Moulton and Stephen Harney call the undercommons, for instance. It's only when you sit down together with other people, as I talked about earlier, getting basic with each other, when you can actually see these lies for what they are. And so I think that's a new phenomenon, the fact that our people are just, completely submerged in this morass. And there's almost no alternative anymore. And this is why, I guess in the last 3 to 4 years, when you start to see these podcasts coming out and, people are creating weird folk TikToks and stuff. People are trying to confront that reality, which introduces another set of contradictions, of course, but sometimes those things work, right? Just yesterday, I was just listening to all of the anti-Western media that's covering what's happening in Gaza. And I'm like, what if you could just package this and put this into a place where everybody can access it? Because it's on TikTok and it's on YouTube Live and people are doing the work, right? But how do we make it accessible in a way that counters the fact that CNN will never say this or BBC will never say this? But that's what the vast majority of our people will be inundated with. So I think the same is true in terms of messages about Blackness. Like, where do people get messages about Blackness from, principally? Right? It's not from us. And it's not even internally generated in the same way anymore, because we don't have the association of life. So I think that's where we are. And that might be the phenomenon that you study in your field. How do we go from this to this? because it is a shift. I don't know if you see it as a shift, but it is a shift. You know, the book that I teach when I do my unit on Black Britain is Ronald Walters's Pan-Africanism in the African Diaspora. And there's 3 chapters on Black Britain. And one of the things that's very clear among the Windrush generation during that particular period is that they understood at some level that racism is part of the antagonism. Like they understood it. Like the survey data backs it up. Like all the organizing that they were doing backs it up. Like, no, this is racism, right? And so it's really striking to me, right, that now that may not be the case as much. So I wish I knew what the shift, or I wish I knew how to counter that shift. Is it time?
Well, I really wish it wasn't, but it is time. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is just, I think we can all agree, an incredibly mind-blowing experience to sit here and engage with you. So thank you, Joshua. And thank you, Remy, for bringing us all together, and everybody else for working.
That's it for Africa Woke Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram at Africa Woke Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa Woke Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muiza Muntali, Africa Woke Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research content contributor and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Watterson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa Woke Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa Woke Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.